welcome to our two guests, and thank you, wives, for actually watching this very fun discussion. Actually, probably that's definitely not going to happen. I don't know who we have to thank for it being our two our two subscribers, but welcome to our little podcast experiment. My name is Eric, and this is David on the other side. Um,
Howdy.
we're just kind of going to try out this format and see what it's like. I know we've had lots of really fun discussions while drunk at parties. So theoretically, this should work. Although, yeah, good, Dave, you've already started, so excellent. But let's
It's
see how
just
it
coffee,
goes.
by the way. Just coffee.
Oh man, old man.
I'm sorry to disappoint. Maybe on a future podcast we'll do something a little different.
I'm in Singapore as well, so there's nothing stronger than a than a Milo here. So okay, so what we're gonna cover a bunch of different topics across the weeks, and I think this one we've pulled race out of the hat, which is a very tough one to start with, but let's see how it goes.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So good to see everyone, both of you, as it were. And as you say, this is a tough topic to tackle in a lot of ways. And just to be clear, I don't have the lived experience of a person of color in the United States. So my personal approach is really going to be from a biological, anthropological, social, and historical, hopefully more or less objective perspective. And then we're going to, chat through some of what we might agree or disagree about. And hopefully this is edifying for folks at large. All right. Okay, so basically, I'm going to start with race and then go into white supremacy and racism, and then specifically in the context of the US environment. And the first thing I really want to start with, which is framing this entire discussion, is that race is not a biological fact, right? If you look at the genetic variety and the genetic markers across different groups of people, race cannot be tied to genetics, and you can have, West Africans and Norwegians be more similar genetically than West Africans and East Africans, for example. And specific characteristics that have arisen in terms of skin tone, facial features, other things, those are genetic realities, but they aren't tied to a genotype that we could nail down to a race. And you can see this just by looking at genetics, obviously, but also the fact that you can have people like you and my wife who are so-called mixed race, which isn't really a meaningful term biologically. That shows that race as a very important factor in people's lives is not biologically grounded. It is, however, very much culturally grounded, and the effects are cultural, social, historical, they're wide-ranging, and the concept of race varies through time and across the world. And so I want to go back historically a little bit and do a ground-up view of how race has been defined over the eras, and then kind of look at some of the impacts that's had, and then focus down a little bit on the US perspective.
So can
So,
I pause
yeah,
and ask questions?
yeah, feel free.
So you say that race is not tied between phenotype and genotype somehow. You're saying that it's a construct. So and then you say, your wife and I are mixed in that we're half Asian and half European. Um, but definitely the shape of my eyes. Like people can tell that I'm not Caucasian when I'm living in the States. They think
Yep.
I'm Filipino, as it turns out, which I'm not. But that's the interpretation in Los Angeles, at least. So there's something there, right? And your wife doesn't look classically European either. So
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, so I'm happy to speak to that. And I did mention that besides skin tone, facial characteristics, and other things, so we can take those separately. So just take skin tone, right?
mhm,
So ultimately, the entire human race originated in Africa. And presumably, although we definitely don't know at this point, everyone was more or less the same skin tone, and it was probably on the darker side of skin tone. Now, as different groups moved north, um, they received less light, and so they tended to have lighter skin to take in more vitamin D, et cetera, et cetera. So skin tone can vary over long time spans by latitude, essentially. So one example of where skin tone doesn't tie genetically is if you look at Australian Aborigines, right? They have very similar skin tone to what we might consider African, but genetically they are not that closely related comparative to other, let's say, actually Filipino Aborigines versus Australian Aborigines, right? So skin tone is not, it arises from genetics, as you say, genotype and phenotype, right? But it's not a specific lineage genetically, right? It more arises out of evolutionary impacts of the environment. And then if you look at other facial features like, eye shape, nose shape, lips, what people tend to characterize as prominent racial characteristics, there's a spectrum, right? And again, it's where we have to differentiate from specific characteristics being the product of genetic evolution versus groups being genetically, definable, especially in terms of a boundary where you could consider a race, right? So, I mean, there are very easy examples of this if you go to Eurasia, right? So Europe through to East Asia, Western Europe to East Asia, single landmass, and you see, from Sweden to, let's say, Japan or even Australasia, you see very different, um, well, Japan not being on the landmass, but let's say China or Korea. You see a spectrum of skin tone less so than other facial characteristics, let's say eye shape, right? And if you get right in the middle in Central Asia, you have people that actually, for my wife, some people think she looks Central Asian, for example. So Eurasian is a group that kind of looks at that overlap of those specific characteristics. But again, the important differentiation is there's no bound, right? So you can't define a race by any set of genetic characteristics, right? And the fact that there can be mixed race means that there's no actual bound in real lived social experience either. And so that's where I want to differentiate it. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that's making more sense. Another question that or another thing you brought up is a assumption that all Homo sapien originally originates in Africa, and and is it also possible that if we think about broadly as European, Asian, and African, um, is there a chance that some of the variety or differences between those genotypes comes from merging with other um, close species like Cro-Magnon man or Neanderthal man or whatever it is? Like,
Yep.
are we sure that one can say definitively that who we are today is coming out of Africa, and there isn't some kind of um, lineage or break off in family tree, right? Because we actually do have a mixing of different genes at a scaled level. Like all Asians are a product of the mixing of migrating folks out of Africa plus some other um
Yeah.
pre-Homo sapien. Yeah.
So, very good point. And I think a good example of that is Neanderthal. So, we have traced Neanderthal DNA to European genetic groups. And obviously, more widely, as we have people making babies all over the world. And so the specific characteristics of Neanderthal, however, aren't strongly expressed. So the strong brow ridge and the high nose and things like that. But I think we need to step back just a little bit. If we go into I don't want to go too hardcore into the science, but if we really look at the genetics, so all of the species, and nothing is definitive in anthropology in because it's an evolving space, and the rise of genetic anthropology has enabled a lot of discoveries. But from what my understanding of the kind of common view scientifically now is, yes, all of those groups did arise in Africa and spread from there, right? Including Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, etc. Now, whether they had starkly different, what we would call racial characteristics, right? Some did, for sure. Neanderthal, for example. Um, how does that interact with what we see in terms of racial characteristics across human beings today? It's not a huge influence. So Neanderthal DNA is a very small part of the human genome. And from our perspective, the species that arose and migrated from Africa um, were a very common genetic group, right? And there were some, obviously, always with evolution, there's some variation as you get different environmental pressures on different groups over long periods of time. However, that is not to say that there was, an Asian subspecies of humankind, of Homo sapiens, that existed. That's just not genetically an accurate way to depict how species arose and changed. It's more that there were. I hate to use this analogy because it can seem insulting, but it's more like dog breeds, right? Where there are characteristics that are shared because of divergent evolution, right? So as um, species as sets of human beings lived in different environments, they would undergo changes from environmental factors as well as from divergent evolution, meaning that you just have sets of genes that separate gradually over time through random mutations, right? Now, the underlying fact of the genetic inheritance is that those differences are very superficial and not strongly tied to any real genetic boundaries between what we would look at or call races. Does that answer kind of where you're
Yeah,
coming from?
yeah, it does. I'm just kind of I just want to challenge from a couple of perspectives,
Sure.
because on behalf of our two viewers, um, but so you're, if I understand correctly, if I paraphrase here, you're basically saying that there's no genetic basis for race because all genetic variation can exist within any of the races, um, and and the differentiation between the I guess the like the differentiation that we see physically, um, well, it's not
So
that it's not tied to genetics.
it's so specific characteristics are tied to genetics, right? And there are variants within different sets of people. Okay, but again, it's the fact that biologically there is. If we look at other species, right, a species
But
has a
it,
defined boundary genetically.
that's so maybe that's what I'm trying to understand. So you're
Yeah,
saying that that there's no subspecies meaning for race. So
correct,
right, is that we're all one species. But
correct.
but okay, so what's the value in that? Because if we go back to the dog example, well, yes, all dogs within the species can breed and they all have the same genetic pool, but the different breeds of dogs are very different. They behave
Okay,
in different ways, like,
yeah,
golden retrievers are house dogs and pit bulls are like, you know, Raoul's dog. They're meaner dogs, right? So they have different behavior, they have different expression, and they look differently. You can
sure.
tell one dog versus another,
Yep,
sometimes maybe even better than
yep.
if we're saying human breeds, or
Mhm.
Homo sapien breeds.
Yeah, well, and that's for specific reasons, right? So the variation across the species of canids is
More
less, sorry,
intentional,
is
fat and
more intentional,
yeah, yeah,
right?
and
So it's been
faster and
specifically bred in. Yeah, so active breeding to select for certain traits will pronounce those traits in a very quick amount of time.
But I don't think that when people talk about race, they are saying that they can't interbreed. So making the distinction that it's all one species is is changing the conversation away from what normal people are thinking of when they say
Yeah.
race.
And again, so this for this, I just wanted to set a grounding expectation and assumption, not to say that this is being challenged by anyone, but that race as a bounded category is not a biological reality. And then I really wanted to move into how the cultural concept of race has evolved over time and how that has impacted
Hmm.
society,
Okay,
right? Yeah. So
let's
if we
keep
can kind
going.
of, yeah, we can take that. And I mean, you know, humans can interbreed. The variations that we see in skin tone and facial features are across the spectrum, can be mixed in different ways. So defining a race, let's say, for example, you said you look Asian, right? So Asia is a giant continent with such variety in and of itself. Then you start, where do you draw lines? And there's really, at the end of the day, biologically, nowhere to draw a line. And that's really just what I'm saying to set the foundation for the discussion.
Okay.
Okay, cool. So um, as humans spread through the world, there were those variations, and they were noted. But through a lot of history uh, and prehistory, it wasn't necessarily considered defining as a category more so than other characteristics such as where you were from or what class you were in. Other characteristics might have had a larger impact on the, kind of the social form of you as an individual. What really changed is when humans from Europe started exploring, quote unquote, and colonizing other territories across the world. Now, this happened at a really interesting time, which is, kind of the 1400s through the 1900s, where human science in that part of the world was really trying to get up to where it would become in the scientific revolution, but wasn't really there yet. However, science was considered influential in certain ways and limited in others. And what happened over time is that as um, Europeans encountered large groups of people that looked different from them, really for the first time in other lands, they created theories on how this could be and how it kind of all fit together. Now, these theories mixed religious ideas as well as kind of pre scientific or early scientific ideas about um, race as a category that was linked with status, with worth, and with kind of closeness to godliness, right? So all these kind of ideas got mixed together, where you'll see anthropologists as late as the 1800s categorizing people in a hierarchy from primitive, right? Say Black Africans were considered the most primitive, to more highly evolved, right? Which would be uh, Latin Americans, Asians, and whites. And for missionaries and colonists, they felt that they had a mission to bring enlightenment and Christianity to primitive, quote unquote, racial groups in other lands. And they used this as one of their justifications for conquering other peoples, controlling them, killing them, extracting their wealth. Um, and, we can sidebar colonialism overall and imperialism and how that came about in a historical context. If you look at something like Guns, Germs, and Steel, that kind of gives you a good overview. But the fact was that as uh, as Western European colonies started being established across the world, and what had been slavery has existed since well before colonial times across the world, unfortunately, but it was never a race-based system in other places. You would find references to slavery in the Bible, for example, and other places, and it would be ethnic groups or people that you had conquered, right, would become your slaves. But it was never the direct linkage between race and slavery that started existing in the colonial era. And that's where we start to get a more deeply entrenched idea of race, status, and hierarchy linked to, economic oppression, slavery, and cultural and social structures to reinforce this racial hierarchy.
So do you think race comes about as a justification for colonialism? And then it evolves from there. Essentially, it's like society, what Western or European society needs a not an excuse, but it needs a justification for why it's okay to treat others in a particular way. And race, you know, pops out as a theory, it's a mental model, and it pops out
Yep.
as like, oh, that's a really good way to justify this. And so then race kind of evolves at the same time the colonial model is being born, and then and the ideas of race then follow colonialism to imperialism to modern capitalism, let's say.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary of what I probably took too long to
Oh,
say.
I'm paraphrasing to make sure that I understand.
No, I understand how the Socratic dialogue works. Don't worry about it. Yeah, so I agree. Now, again, when I say we both use the word justification, um, yes, that hierarchical model, both from a scientific side and from a Christian side, were used as one of the justifications, right, for colonialism and then imperialism. I think there were other justifications. Until recently on Earth, you didn't need a moral justification to conquer people. It just wasn't even on the table, right? You had a bigger army, you wanted to conquer someone, you just did. You didn't say you were justified for any reason. But I do think as we get into more enlightenment thinking, then you go from cruder ideas of race and hierarchy to more refined ones, because if you start to think of yourself as an enlightened Western Christian person, as you pointed out, subjugating and exploiting people um, cannot sit that well morally. And so having a Christian and scientific justification for that can help moralize it. But I think for a lot of people, it was just might makes right, and I want money.
Interesting. I'm suddenly forgetting my timeline here about which came first, the Enlightenment or colonialism. I feel like it's Enlightenment with
Colonialism.
colonialism comes first.
Yeah.
So I'd be interested to see then, statistically in terms of the amount race is referred to across the decades in time, and it would be interesting to see that you don't really get reference to it before the Enlightenment, and then in early Enlightenment you also don't really see reference to it, but as soon as colonialism starts to take off, then everybody has this uh what I'm thinking of it as Christian guilt, basically, like because the
Yeah.
the the tenets of colonialism and the things that we're doing to other gods, people around the earth is is problematic. So we invent racism, and then we say, well, these people they're not just inferior because they haven't found God yet, but because they're
And
physically slash
mentally,
genetically and mentally unable to, yeah. um
well, that they're less evolved, right?
right,
So,
right, right.
so there, I want to address 2 points there separately. So one is I'm not going to do a statistical study
Hmm.
of
Yeah, yeah,
all
I'm just saying
history
it'd be
right now.
interesting to
Yeah,
see that
but
if there's
but
a
I
correlation.
think I can say anecdotally that we're both quite well read, and you do see race treated very differently over time in literature and in science. And the kind of the interesting turning point that is going to bring us to the next phase of this is that, Darwinian evolution was actually misused and abused by anthropologists to say not only is this just a difference in kind, it's a difference in, evolutionary adaptation. It's a difference in evolutionary scale, and it's kind of linear. And a lot of the misunderstandings of Darwin, when they say survival of the fittest, they think, oh, the eugenicists and the Nazis use this to say, well, let's just get all the fittest people and bring them together to breed. And in colonial and later times, that the people that are fittest are more evolved, right? But a, a clearer reading of that, even that statement of Darwinian evolution, survival of the fittest, is your fitness is in relation to your environment, right?
Right.
So it's environmental fit, not fitness as in physical
Who's
fitness, and I'm really
Uberman?
fit. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that somewhat intentional misreading and misinterpretation of Darwin underlies a lot of the, we went to racial hierarchy, but we're kind of leading into eugenics and
Yeah.
that thinking as well.
So if we have another 500,000 years of ice age caused by global warming, then there's going to be different phenotypes that are actually more fit for that environment, and then race is going to be in big trouble again. Your Ubermen might not, you may be the worst possible um, selection.
Well, I didn't have that as an item to discuss, but I think it's if we project it into the future, I think what we would see is, you know, these genetic variations came about over very long time spans, is what happens during evolution, and with isolated cohorts.
Right.
And, that's no longer the case, right? So we have international travel, we have populations moving here and there. And so, those phenotypes, those racial categories are definitely going to break down. And unless something like sexual selection or eugenics or something else comes in, those racial categories are just going to break down more and more because the way these cohorts,
Because the
uh,
phenotypes merge, because you
yeah,
get people like me and your wife who are mixed,
yeah,
and then the what you can see as race, what people think they can clearly see as race, disappears to where you just can't see anymore.
yeah, exactly.
And then it all comes down to cranium size. I'm just kidding.
Well, it is interesting because as we look to the future of evolution, I mean, obviously humans have adapted in a way differently than other species in that culture evolves much more quickly than biology. And most of the advantages or disadvantages that humans have are based on culture. And so,
I mean,
you know,
I would put culture as a type of technology myself. So I would say there's only biology and technology. Culture is a technology, and technology is what's actually evolving faster than biology.
we could have that discussion. This is probably not the time or place. Um, but but again, so those racial categories just become an entirely different thing over time. All right,
Hmm.
so I do want to kind of take the next step, which is to get to the American context, right? So when we take those racial hierarchies that were, reaffirmed by Christian thought and pseudoscience and eugenics and tied to a racial hierarchy that justified slavery, then you have a racialized form of slavery in the US that becomes different than historical types of slavery, but also more entwined in the social fabric, the economic fabric, and honestly, the political fabric of the identity of the American ideal, right? And so that conflicts obviously with some other American ideals in terms of, the deistic kind of scientific enlightenment view of the world. But compromises were made, such as the Three-Fifths Compromise in the Constitution, the Electoral College arising out of slave states wanting more representation. And so there was this push and pull within American society grappling with the issue of slavery and its concomitant intertwinement with the issue of race. And when we get to the era of the Civil War, you get the abolition of slavery, but as an institution, once that ends, the repercussions are really dramatic and interesting in ways that I don't think people always understand so clearly. I think when people look at terms like white privilege and they say, well, slavery was so long ago and I'm not a slave owner and I don't have privilege, but it wasn't that long ago. And what I want to look at is kind of the period between the abolition of slavery and today when we talk about the concept of white supremacy. Now, white supremacy takes a couple of forms, right? So, one is the inherent racism in certain structures of government, law, cultural norms. And then the other is people who actively are proponents of white supremacy as a concept. So I kind of want to keep those a little bit separate. You can think of white supremacists as people who thought, make America great again, like during slavery, because that was the right way to do it. And this kind of folds into Christian nationalism and a lot of ideas like that. But you also have to look at what happened to institutions that were, you know, integrated, ironically using that word, with slavery after the abolition of slavery, right? So one of the things that you have to be clear about is the institution of slavery just deformed all the other institutions in America. So one example we can start with is the because slaves didn't want to be slaves, one organization or multiple organizations of the same function that had to be set up was people hired to catch runaway slaves, and also a class of overseers to control large groups of slaves, right? And as slavery was abolished, those people basically were transformed into police forces, And the modern American police force, to some degree, arose from slave catchers and slave overseers. And explicitly in the South, plantation owners used the prison system as a way to transfer Black Americans, African Americans, from slaves to incarcerated servants that did the same jobs. They got nominal pay, um, but the plantation system functioned very similarly. So you had these former slave catchers and overseers who would arrest African Americans that were former slaves, put them in jail. The jail, the carceral system, would uh, essentially lease out these workers to the same plantation owners that had slaves, and they would have the same essential population working in another form of indentured servitude through the legal and carceral system that was put in place following slavery. I'll just take a pause right there.
Mm, a lot of stuff in there. So I think so. I'm aligned to you that structural racism exists, and that the institution of slavery did. I think you said deform rather than inform, which I like. It say the institution of slavery deforms other societal institutions around it. I'm with you there 100%. I think the the slave catchers and the overseer class starting modern police feels a stretch only because how did police form in the northern states, right? And I think that the role that the police as an institution um, existed before abolition. Maybe what you could say is in the South, that institution was captured by folks that are migrating from a job that is now turned illegal into. So where are you going to go? So I used to be
Yep.
a slave catcher. Where am I going to go? The police makes a pretty good next step
Yep.
for me. And then as this group captures that institution in the South, then they naturally turn it into their their vision of what they want. So that would make sense. So I wouldn't say like I think I think police in America, I think it's not right to say it's founded, and I'm thinking of like if a Black Lives Matter person was making an argument to me that the reason that the police force is where we are today is because it's fundamentally rooted in slavery. That's a hard leap for me to make. Deformed by slavery, yes,
Yeah.
and captured in some states. That also I can see how that happens, but um, but but yeah, not so extreme. Um, what I the Yeah, yeah. So
Okay.
and then the other thing that I pulled out that I think is really important is this definition of white supremacy is one, it's um the manipulation of structures in society to to drive a kind of social hierarchy. And in
Hmm.
the case of America, because we're founded just post-Enlightenment, post-colonialism, like America is founded in the historical midst of what you were just talking about, is like it's the perfect time
Yeah.
to
It couldn't have
form.
happened any other
It
way
was
at
a
any other
perfect,
time.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then the other thing about you said there were slaves prior to the triangle, if you will, the slave triangle. Prior
The
to that,
triangle trade.
yeah, prior to that, we didn't think of slavery as racially based. It's actually
Yep.
more often of conquered people based. That's the more often way. But then the nice thing about post the American UK East Africa triangle thing is, well, when the slaves get to the US, it's very easy to identify them based on this new fake concept of race. And then it's easy to justify. Now you have all of this. Christian guilt stuff able to justify the institution of slavery. So it's all self-reinforcing. It's all happening at the perfect time
Right.
to make everything kind of work together. Um, and then you said
So
so, so one is structure, and then the second one is that there's sort of a militant side to white supremacy, which is that one, it's a fundamental belief or so fundamental restructuring of society to um, make one type of person have a harder chance of it. And then there's the military side, militant side, which is like to reinforce that and continue that and to, you said, make America great again. But by the way, I think what we know, for those of you who are listening, we're speaking on November 6th our time, right? But so the Trump election just happened, and I would say, one of the things that kind of was going to come out of that, of course, is that 60 million US people are not white supremacists. So I think
no.
it's dangerous to paint it as Make America Great Again is somehow linked. Make America Great Again is clearly a very broad coalition of different peoples, which includes
Yeah.
white supremacists. But
So
yeah.
yeah. Okay. So let me, for the sake of argument, back off a couple of claims just a little bit. So I do think in another forum I could provide more evidence and data to support the more direct influence that the overseer and slave catching class had on policing, not just in the South, but in the North. And to say that policing as we understand it today actually didn't exist before the abolition of slavery. But I don't want to get distracted by that. And I'm happy to go with your interpretation, which is a bit softer, but I think still captures the essence of where we're going with this.
Mm.
The second is, okay, I was a little glib with referencing MAGA. Um, I do think some of the dangers of the subset of the MAGA movement are Christian nationalist and white supremacist. And I think that, we can get into misinformation and disinformation to support those ideas. I do not want to go there right now. I don't think it's the time. It's too fresh, and we can't really take an objective historical perspective on it right now. And I'd rather stick to things that we can. So, all right. So we have the police class and the carceral system and the justice system kind of informed after the abolition of slavery by racial hierarchies and economic interests in extracting labor from former slaves. And you get the right to vote with the 14th Amendment. Slaves are made full citizens. However, there's systematic disenfranchisement, often quite violent, lynching, poll taxes, poll tests. You have the KKK, very explicit, active and violent white supremacist movements reacting to the abolition of slavery and the upheaval in society and the economy that resulted from that. And that, those really, the Reformation era, which showed so much promise, faced a very quick backlash, which reversed a lot of the gains during the Reformation. I mean, during the Reformation, just post abolition, there was representation in government by former slaves. There was a broadening of the electorate, but then a sharp backlash post Reformation. And kind of that era to the civil rights era is a key period that I want to focus on a little bit more. So you get post-Reformation backlash. You have codified segregation. You have very active suppression of voting rights. You have in housing, you have things like redlining, which segregates the ability of owning homes. Um, you have Jim Crow laws. Um, you have, I mentioned the KKK, very active and very influential, very violent. And you have the beginnings of the civil rights movement getting pushback from the government, including the FBI, right? So you have civil rights leaders being actively, such as MLK, being actively tracked and countered by the FBI. The Black Panthers, Malcolm X, um, the FBI was actively infiltrating these groups. Uh, you know, Nation of Islam for Malcolm X, um, and trying to subvert them and undermine their ability to create social change. So these this push and pull in the post Reconstruction, not Reformation, that was the wrong term, Reconstruction era, um, through the Civil Rights era, uh, really comes to a head in the 60s. And what happens during the 60s is you get the assassination of major civil rights leaders, um, some under very strange circumstances. Um, and you get the assassination also of political leaders that were aligned with civil rights leaders. So not only, folks in the Black Panthers and Malcolm X and MLK, but also JFK and RFK and folks like that. And that did stall some of the sense of political momentum that civil rights had. There was absolutely progress, hard fought for. Um, but as you get into the 70s and the 80s, you had the crackdown, from Nixon on crime and disorder. Um, you get to the 70s and the 80s, and it's losing steam. And one of the reasons that the civil rights movement lost steam was also, and I have to refer to sources such as the Christian Science Monitor for this, but the CIA was actively bringing crack cocaine into the United States and distributing it through uh, Black leaders in civil rights movements, but also in gangs, and helping to create the crack economy that you and I lived through. And it was extremely violent and decimated the African American population, not just through crime and violence, but also through mass incarceration. And the effects of that are being felt, over time. If you see incarceration rates for African Americans, they're just much, much higher than for white Americans. And the vestiges of the government pushing back against civil rights in a very active way is not a historical artifact. It's something that is really still with us today.
So I'm with you on all of this. I'm with you on all the history. I've read some of the same books, and I've at least watched some of the same movies, and TV shows. But here's where, if you're just listening, and I'm trying to understand, like, how is, say, somebody from the non-disgusting MAGA coalition gonna hear this, right? And so it sounds a bit conspiracy, right? So you've got, like, the CIA. Okay, now how are we gonna mess with the black people now and keep them down? So, because it almost sounds so coordinated. Because look, we're gonna systematically screw at least African Americans at every junction, and how do you do that without coordination? And so, is this a conspiracy? Is this a conspiracy? Are the people who are doing it, are they doing it explicitly with the goal of where we are today? Did they want to get us to where we are today?
Well, let me cover that from a couple different angles. I mean, the first is, unlike a conspiracy theory, there is hard evidence and journalism and history with evidence and facts to back up these statements. It is not controversial at this point, I don't think, to say that J. Edgar Hoover was wiretapping MLK, for example. I mean, we have that evidence. We know that happened. We know that FBI agents were undercover in the Black Panthers. This is Freedom of Information Act information. There is a ton of documentation around this.
Yeah.
If you go to the specifics of kind of the war on drugs, right? Um, I don't, and this is where structural,
And commercial incarceration, right? It's
yep.
the war on drugs into the current prison system, right? So is it that you've got, Nancy Reagan, and she's like, aha, I'm gonna, this is your brain on drugs, and now I'm gonna use that to keep down the black man? Or is it that there are sort of all of these streams that are coming together emerge in an emergent way?
Well, what I would say is it's not emergent because it's more vestigial, right? So this is a continuation rather than an emergence. So,
So
but
so
it was the policy of the FBI, right, that saw civil rights movements and Black Panther members with guns as the enemy within, as a very scary situation for the government, right? And
and then
so,
they're predisposed to think of the Black Panthers that way because of the history that you're painting, kind of going all the way back to colonialism,
yeah,
right? So the everybody is predisposed to think in a certain way, and therefore bringing crack into black neighborhoods is a reasonable approach to reducing the potential damage of terrorist organizations that are starting to blossom within the U.S. in the 1960s.
yeah, I think that's again. I'll just cut out all my parts and just put in your restatements of what I said because it's much more pithy. Um, yeah. So again, so as a continuation of some of these, systems of hierarchy and reinforcing hierarchy, and as so again, it doesn't take that many people who are actively, knowingly white supremacists, like J. Edgar Hoover,
Mhm.
within these places of power to create enormous
Mm.
disenfranchisement and suffering for large communities. And this again, this is a generation ago. This is during our lifetime. We lived through part of
Yeah.
these events. Um, so I guess one of the reasons why I wanted to discuss this topic is there's a real temptation by people to say, can't we just leave this behind us? Can't we just be colorblind? Can't we just, move forward? And I didn't do these things. They're historical artifacts from way, way in the past. And what I have to say is, the fact that the Electoral College still exists is a vestige of slavery, right? The fact that African American men are incarcerated, you know, double, triple the rate of white Americans is a vestige of this system. The fact that those generations of wealth, right, that were accrued during slavery by white families, you know, spread through the generations and exists now, and gives those families, they're starting on third base. And so when people say affirmative action is ridiculous, DEI is ridiculous, their framing of it is, well, these inequalities, they might exist, but they're either just because of race, or we can get rid of them by just moving forward without considering race. But these systems that have been perpetuated with the cultural construct of white supremacy, they don't stop having that impact unless we actively fight against them. Okay, let's take a quick break there.
All right.
There you are. Okay, right. So I mean, the intention of this discussion is just kind of a broad overview. These are huge topics. There are books and podcasts and journalism covering and academic classes covering a lot of these things in much greater detail. I just thought it would be useful kind of to give an overview of that specific lineage of the concept of race. I do you think we've done something here?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that what I would say is that to some degree this argument exists out there, and
Sure.
and and the conversation you have coming up next, I think might be more interesting, in that, um, I think there's still like nerdy kind of definitional things to talk about, and um, philosophical things, but I'm interested in the conversation about now what. Like, you were kind of saying, on the one hand, you got a bunch of people who, and I think that's represented in large in the MAGA movement, is sort of the, hey, listen, we didn't do it. Maybe it exists, but if these, black families just get themselves bootstrapped up, and the fathers can stay at home, and they can get good jobs and follow the American path, and everything will work itself out in the end. We had other disenfranchised, disadvantaged folks, the Chinese. I mean, they were not slaves per se, but they were pretty, yeah, right. And then hey, but like Asian Americans are, you know getting preferential treatment at Harvard, right? So I can see that there is a group that would say that, and that can be a pretty compelling argument versus, um, it's like when you look at the giant web, the emergent web of reality that we have today, where racism. And again, we have a problem because we just said there is no such thing as racism. We never talked
No,
about the
no such
cultural,
thing as race. There is such thing as
biology,
race.
right?
Yeah.
But I mean, there's no construct biologically, but we didn't establish that. Well, we didn't really establish the cultural, um, um, creation of
Categories.
race. We didn't really do that. So anyway, but if you imagine that, over the 300-year span, we've created this very, very complex, interlocked, it touches every aspect of our institutions, it touches every aspect of culture, so deeply ingrained. um that's pretty intimidating. Like, how do you solve that? You have to rip everything down and start from scratch.
Yeah.
How are you possibly going to, um how are you ever gonna get past this? How are you ever going to make things better? It's pretty intimidating when you look at it from that perspective.
Yeah. And let me just solve that in the next 30 seconds. No, so one point that I think is valid is, we've talked about uh, some specific forms of racism, and I do want to broaden that out, right? So, the American white supremacist version of racism as related to slavery and African Americans is different than other kinds of racism, and other kinds of racism absolutely exist. What I would say, a bit contrary to your example of the Chinese, definitely anti-immigrant racist sentiment hugely, but by and large, most Asian Americans and most Hispanic Americans are intentional immigrants of recent heritage. You know, it's not that a bunch of the Chinese Americans that are in America now are much more recent intentional immigrants than the African Americans in the US, right? There is absolutely racism against Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, other groups. It's just a little bit of a different type. And I think racism against those other groups does get tied together by uh, conceptions of racial hierarchy and vestiges of white supremacy. So I think they kind of blend, but they're structurally and historically a little bit different. And I think one way to look at that is to look at how racism functions in other parts of the world. Um, and just as one example, you and I have both lived in Asia. I currently live in Europe. You're still over in Singapore. Um, there's plenty of racism. you know, I mean, I don't know if I've ever met anyone as overtly racist as a lot of Chinese people. But they're not shy about it. Now, they're not necessarily working within systems and structures that reinforce that racism, right? But those attitudes of racial hierarchy and difference definitely exist across other regions of the world. So um, maybe we can leave next steps to the end. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about how you see racism in the Asian context, but also how race and the concept of race and racism has impacted you personally as someone of mixed race in your life.
Jeez. Well, the second question first. When I've thought about, because I've obviously people have asked me that before, um, my initial answer is that I haven't really been affected by racism, or at least I haven't perceived myself as being. Maybe it's happened, but I didn't realize it was happening. Maybe somebody saw my last name on a CV and didn't proceed to interview me, but I never knew that happened. Um, so to tell you the truth, I don't feel like I felt it. I don't think I've felt being treated differently because of race. But I think also I was born into the upper middle class, and I have remained in the upper middle class and lower, higher class, or whatever. That's been my socioeconomic journey, and that I think is way more impactful than race.
You're in the 1%, my man.
Yes, yes, yes.
And I would
But
also
I mean,
say
but I was born into upper middle class, and then I
in Los Angeles.
in Los Angeles, which is, oh yeah, of course, is globally top 1% for sure, for sure. Um, and
Well,
I
but
think
also a
that
much more racially diverse environment.
correct, correct, and in a more liberal leaning, and obviously I'm aware of all of these ideas and critical race theory, and I already have an affinity towards all of that stuff. Um, but anyway, so what I'm saying in my experience, I think class has overshadowed race in my experience, and certainly in Asia, um, or at least in Southeast Asia, and I'm in Singapore, which is an ex British colony. Um, I get the benefits of being I'm the white guy in the Asian context, so I get all the benefits from that, actually. And although, yeah, maybe there's racist, um, no, there's no racist, there's no structural negative, uh, nothing structurally that's stopping me because I am of the hegemonic power, if you will. That I have been, the society has been structured to help me,
Yeah,
in Asia especially.
yeah.
Um, so I've only benefited from racism. Yay! Um, um,
Yay, white privilege. Whee!
um,
So Go ahead.
The other thing that I want to just throw out there is in terms of definitions. Um, I was always brought up in when I was thinking about this stuff from Berkeley and from UCLA is that um, most people talk about prejudice as being racist, and they call prejudice thinking and prejudice behavior and prejudice perceptions as racism. And in fact, prejudice is just prejudice. Racism is the institutionalization of those prejudices. So it's like I have a prejudice against some perceived group, biologically or not real, but there's a group that I perceive, and that's just prejudice. It's not racist to say that Neanderthals have flat, thick skulls. That's not racist. That's prejudiced. Um,
I wouldn't even call it prejudice. It's just Judas. I don't know. It's, there are facts, right?
Well, okay, then black people have wide noses, or Asian people are good at math, right? Then that's
I would
prejudiced.
take that one. The last one I would take.
The second one you like, okay.
Yeah.
Um, but what I would say is that isn't racism. Racism only happens when you institutionalize that prejudice to differentiate people's access or people's power within a system. So it doesn't become racist until you say that because Asians are good at math, then their SAT results need to be higher in order to be equivalent or to make things fair, to make the playing field fair. I don't think that exists, that policy exists, but that would be an example is where you're institutionalizing prejudice. So one thing I would just note is this difference between prejudice and racism. Um,
I think from my perspective, the problem is, yes, we would like to move towards a world that is colorblind, that is race agnostic, let's say, right? Where there's no specific prejudice or racism
but
that has been tucked in.
I liked your original opening though. But I don't think that's possible. I don't think
No,
that's
no,
within
I
physics.
just let me make a couple quick points here. One is, so the danger I see in and kind of the informing of prejudice into racism and those structures is, if when you say Asians are good at math, that has no genetic basis. It's reinforcing a racial construction of the way you view the world, which can be used to justify racism, right? So the reason I think,
Right,
and
right, right,
some
right.
progressives would say that, if you have that prejudice, the reason it's dangerous is because you are identifying people by their race and generalizing about them, and that in the structures that we have in society, then that opens up the opportunity for racist oppression of various sorts. But the second thing I would say is, I know you can say that we'll never get to a race agnostic world, but I do think we will. And when I say that, because I do think we're all going to be pretty muddy in 100,000 years, right? The genetics and the characteristics are, so Sam Harris puts it a specific way, which is ultimately the goal would be that there are differences in hair color, but it doesn't really impact anything, and there's no judgment about people based on their hair color. There will always be variations in skin color and facial features, but if it has no actual relevance to anything other than aesthetics in your life, then that's what we would want to get to, right? Now we've got a long way between here and there.
I don't think it's possible. I think that I think that the human brain is biologically wired to create other, and they will create categories. Humans will create category. If one category starts to be less effective, they'll just use another category to
Oh,
have
I agree.
prejudices, and then to turn that into institutionalized
I
prejudice.
agree, but it could just be that race is no longer one of them,
It could,
right?
but again, I still, well, gosh,
I mean, taking the long view, 100,000 years.
we'll all be dead in 100,000 years because we won't last that long.
Okay, let's not get into that. Uh,
um,
well, can we just park that for a moment and maybe revisit that at the end? I
but
do,
does
yeah,
it matter? Does it matter? Does it matter whether it's racism, classism, it's star-bellied sneeches or non-star-bellied sneeches? Does it even matter? So it's society will find a way to other groups so that you have multiple groups that they distinguish because humans are biologically predisposed, I'm going to argue, to do that. It's wired into us to do that,
yeah,
and those prejudices then will work their way into systemic you know, to the systems, and that what matters is that we figure out how to de-prejudice systems,
yeah.
not
And
that
that's
we
where,
de-prejudice humanity.
yeah, and I think that's the exact point, right? I think, yes, evolutionarily, we are, I would not say hardwired, more soft wired, right? To differentiate between us and them, right? In group, out group, right? That's kind of a cultural evolution of the species that is pretty firmly part of our software, if not our hardware. And we can kind of get into that in a different way another time. I would say that that's part of our evolutionary cultural heritage that's very strong. Um, but I think your point is the right one, which is okay, well, when we recognize systems that are reinforcing these othering, these disenfranchisement behaviors, and we can try to counteract that and dismantle those, right? Then we can start to have a view of what systems would look like that did not rely on or integrate that sort of hierarchical thinking. And you know, human history is very long, and prehistory is much longer even. And again, these racial hierarchies and capitalism itself and the democratic form of government, these are very recent inventions, in the scope of human evolution. And so I think they're much more malleable than we think they are, and that they will change, and we can inform them to change in a direction that we want them to, you know. So I do think that's kind of what we need to focus that effort on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that. I think it would be. I think at a high. I'd love to have a longer discussion on whether it's possible. I'm in a frustrated moment now, right? Because we've backslid so far from the gains that we've made, and I wonder, is it even possible to decompose systems and reform them without the prejudices built in, or whether you have to burn the whole thing down, right? I know a lot of people in the MAGA camp, the libertarians, who are like, yeah, we don't want Trump. We don't like Trump. Trump is going to burn the whole thing down, and that's what we want him to do. We hate the existing system so much, and we believe that the existing system is so unable to get better that the only thing that we can do is burn the whole thing down and start again. And they see Trump as an agent of chaos, basically, to do that as a forest fire, if you will. Um, I don't know.
Well, I mean, I can understand kind of that thinking from both sides to a degree. And again, I don't want to ground this kind of in the current moment. I do want to take the
Right.
lighter perspective, but I can see that from a libertarian or from a progressive perspective, there are these motivations or drives to completely dismantle systems and start over, right? From both sides. I mean, there's definitely been progressive movements, though,
Hmm. Hmm.
that have said we need to burn everything down, and from the right, there are similar ideas. I just I tend to believe that the suffering involved is not
Yeah.
worth the small probability that the next system is somehow going to be magically better from the same people making it.
Yeah.
So that concerns me quite a bit.
All right. Well, we're just reaching the end of our time. Loads of stuff to still talk about on the topic, but it was fun. So this is our first one. I'm not supposed to say that because we don't know what order we're going to release them in. But
uh, we can we can edit like crazy. Don't worry about it.
this was fun. But I have my next meeting with Germans. You know, Germans have to be on time for everything. I thought I would end with a nice. That was a joke. That was a joke.
I
Uh,
was going to make another one that was going to be even less PC. It's like you better be careful going into a meeting with Germans. I know your mother's background. Okay, no, but seriously, yeah. Thanks for this, Erica. I think it's been really engaging. I hope at some point some people will find something edifying about this, and we'll keep evolving and pivoting and structure this in a way that it's fun for us and hopefully fun for others. And maybe
Awesome.
some topics that are a little less serious as well.
Yeah, sure. All
All right.
right, let me stop the recording here so we have a nice
Thank
end.
you.
All right. Okay, dude. I will talk to you later. I'll